I'm the Philosophical Bachelor, and today I'm going to talk about what is being. Introduction to Metaphysics is a series of lectures by Martin Heidegger in 1935 at the University of Freiburg. It was published as a book in 1953. Some brief remarks are in order for us to properly understand its context and importance. It comes after Being and Time, Heidegger's seminal but uncompleted book, which was published in 1927. Heidegger's aim was to ultimately discuss the nature of being in relation to time, as suggested by the title Being and Time, but he ultimately forsook that project. Hence, Being and Time is really about Dasein and Time. Dasein is a technical word to indicate the class of beings that question what being is, which is good and requires analysis, but is not quite being qua being as Heidegger intended. You can see why he had to examine Dasein prior to addressing the question of being, because human beings, as Dasein, are implicated in the very question of asking what being is, since we are precisely the kind of beings that are troubled by that question. Without Dasein, there would be no thing asking and then attempting to answer the question of being. Therefore, his introduction to metaphysics is not just a companion to Being and Time, but according to Richard Polt and Gregory, who translated the introduction, its rightful heir. Thus, one way to approach Heidegger is to read him in chronological order, reading first Being and Time and then the introduction. However, for novices, Being and Time has several barriers to entry, since Heidegger's convoluted style can make his writing difficult to decipher. Since the introduction is a lecture series, it is much easier to understand. It may be that Heidegger himself may have trouble speaking the same way he writes. Hence, it may be better to first read the introduction, which will then serve as a foundation to tackle Being and Time, having now understood Heidegger's bigger project, his vast erudition and penchant for neologisms, where he invents or compounds words to suit his purposes. While the introduction is easier, it does not mean it is easy. It is not only not by any means easy to understand, it is also not an introduction to metaphysics. Or it is, but not quite metaphysics as it is commonly understood. Metaphysics is the study of the nature of reality. The Greek term metaphysica literally means beyond physics, beyond the physical. The aim being to examine what underlies reality, such that reality can be the way it is. Metaphysics attempts to explain why nature or reality is the way it is. Heidegger's contribution to metaphysics is different from the offerings of other thinkers of metaphysics. They usually propose a unique metaphysical system. For instance, Plato posits a theory of forms, where what is really real is in a transcendent realm, the intelligible realm of forms, while what we encounter in this sensible realm are just poor imitations. Benedictus de Spinoza talks about Deus siva natura, where there is no transcendent realm, and how God is manifested entirely in nature and is nature. Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz proposes monads as the fundamental building blocks of stuff. George Berkeley tells us that there is no material physical realm. It is all just in our minds. This is called idealism, as opposed to materialism, where there is only the physical and nothing else besides the physical. Heidegger is not proposing a metaphysical system. He thinks that such system building is misplaced or at least premature. They try to describe beings but should have first settled the foremost question of metaphysics, which is, what is being? Beings and being are not the same. Being is not a being. So, no, Heidegger's introduction to metaphysics is not an introduction to metaphysics, where a teacher explains the various systems proposed by various philosophers. Heidegger presumes a familiarity with the various systems. He will discuss a few metaphysical systems to critique them. But yes, his introduction to metaphysics is an introduction to metaphysics in the sense that he will tackle what he views as the primary task of metaphysics, what it should be about, which is not about beings, but about being. I would depend on Gregory Fried's entry in the Bloomsbury Companion to Heidegger to summarize the introduction. I have read the introduction, but I'm leery of reading it again in order to write this essay. As I had explained, while the book is not terribly difficult, it is not easy, and to read it once more so soon will be punishing. I will naturally also include some of my own ideas and comments, the way I had already just done. Heidegger thinks the way philosophers since Plato have approached metaphysics has only obscured its vital question. Instead of examining the nature of being qua being, they have gone and examined beings, the multifarious stuff of reality. He suggests that this is why metaphysics has become vacuous. The word being has become like vapor, devoid of meaning and importance. However, this is mistaken. He considers the meaning of being as the spiritual fate of the West. Whether we realize it, we depend on the metaphysics in deciding how to live. For instance, if one believes in God as creator and supreme power, then one will presumably live according to the commands of such a God. If one believes that human beings are the highest creation with dominion over all other beings, then that will influence how one acts towards those other beings. Our metaphysics informs our ethics. Hence, to figure out metaphysics is vital, and the first critical step in metaphysics is, according to Heidegger, to figure out what being is. In another lecture entitled What is Metaphysics?, delivered in 1929 in the University of Freiburg. Hence, between Being and Time and the introduction, Heidegger proposes that the one questioning what metaphysics is, what is being, is himself implicated in the answer. It is only human beings that ask such questions, since we are the kind of beings for which being is itself an issue. He will call such beings, the beings for which being is itself an issue, Dasein, literally being there, a being that is thrown into the world. Recall that being is not a being. One way Heidegger unearths the meanings of words is to examine its etymology, especially in Greek, as an ancient language, the language of ancient Greece as the place where Western civilization began. According to him, in the development of language from Greek to Latin, some linguistic ideas become distorted, leading to a change that then informs how we think about things. While language comes from our experience of reality, it also informs our experience of reality. The example I often cite on this point is the concept of race. Is it that we originally experience other people through the lens of race, where we see them as the same or differing race from ourselves? Or is it that the concept of race, which we have invented, makes us see people through a racial lens? Heidegger explains that being in Greek, tuon, is a verb meaning to be. A verb is a word describing actions or states. However, because of the infinitive form of verbs in Latin, We later got verbal substantives in the younger Indo-European languages. Such a noun is formed from a verb, which then makes the state of being, the verb to be, into a thing. He writes, the substantive Dasein implies that what is so named itself is. Being now itself becomes something that is, whereas obviously only beings are, and it is not the case that being also is. This point is critical to understanding Heidegger. When he says being, he means it as a verb, where being is to be, a process and not an entity. Hence, when he hyphenates words with being, like being in the world, he means to be in the world. Being human meaning to be human. The verb form implies process, which means time is involved. Fried explains that this makes being finite, historical, and situated in a context. How we understand what it means to be is the departure for the understanding of our entire existence, he adds. Being is hence originary, an inception or departure point for all the rest of existence. It is what gives history its trajectory. What Heidegger is essentially trying to do is to go back to basics, back to the start, to see what may have been lost or forgotten in the possible conceptions of being that we presently have. For something to be, it is living, emerging, abiding, a coming to presence. It is not something permanently there like some eternal essence or Platonic form, but something that comes to be and therefore may cease to be. It has a history. I've earlier mentioned how Heidegger goes to ancient Greek sources to get close to the inception of Western philosophy, but also mentioned that from Plato onwards, he saw that the philosophers have obscured the vital question of being in metaphysics. Plato's teacher was Socrates, and they were early in the timeline, but are not the first. The first Greek philosophers are known collectively as the pre-Socratics because they came before Socrates. Two pre-Socratics Heidegger refers to in the introduction are Parmenides and Heraclitus. Both these thinkers, and many in that time, wrote poems entitled On Nature because they were trying to establish what Aristotle will later call first philosophy. Today, this first philosophy Aristotle refers to is known as metaphysics. The reason why metaphysics is first among the topics of philosophy is because how nature is will inform everything else, such as our ethics. Nature in Greek is physis, but Heidegger will argue that its original meaning is being. Indeed, if both Parmenides and Heraclitus had their respective poem titles translated as On Being, it will be suitable since, as Heidegger explains, their take on being is closer to tackling the question of being as being than the later philosophers. It is physis, being or nature, that is emerging and abiding. Heraclitus in one extant fragment talked about polemos, which most translators translate as war, but not Heidegger, who translated as struggle or confrontation. Heidegger will make a similar move for many Greek terms he depends upon to make his arguments. He will render these terms in unusual ways, differing from the usual translations, but are still related. Hence, his translations are eminently plausible, not to mention that he was schooled in the classics and know Greek and Latin the way philosophy scholars of his time would. With polemos, his point was that it is through struggle that things can be known to us. It is when we struggle with what things are and how they differ from other things that things take on distinctions so that they can be differentiated from one another and not be all lumped together as the same. The fragment in question is usually translated as, "War is the father and king of all." That is puzzling since war usually does not birth things but rather kills and destroys them. Heidegger's reading is that it is the struggle between things that brings them into distinct identity and gives them unique names. In that way, it brings unity and logos. Logos has many meanings and is usually translated as word, knowledge, reason, or speech, but Heidegger translates it as gathering. Logos as language gathers together the world, assembling it even as it divides it up into intelligible parts that can come into presence for us. It is when struggle ceases, where there is no longer any contestation over a meaning of a word, concept, or idea, that those meanings become concretized, fixed, and then is taken for granted, no longer requiring interpretation. According to Heidegger, there are 4 ways we try to delimit being. 1. Being and becoming. 2. Being and seeming. 3. Being and thinking. And 4. Being and the odd. The first way, being and becoming, is the classical opposition between Parmenides and Heraclitus. For Parmenides, being is fixed, constant, and unchanging, while for Heraclitus, being comes into being through a process of becoming. In the second, being and seeming, what seems to not be what is. Seeming and being are opposed. Heidegger is, however, not rejecting these ways, but reinterpreting them so that they are not restrictive but elucidating. Heidegger views being as what unfolds as appearing. When being appears to us, it is unfolding itself as it appears, so as to manifest itself. He uses the Greek word aletheia, which is usually translated as truth, but for Heidegger has the sense of unconcealment. Truth as correctness is less fundamental than truth as appearing and derives from the latter. However, such appearing, which is being as seeming, was problematized by Plato. Plato's theory of forms posits that what is real is the form or idea that resides in a transcendent realm, while the form's instantiations in our sensible realm are just a poor imitation of the form. These instantiations only seem to be real, but are in fact less real than the forms. Heidegger thinks that the pre-Socratic notions, as unearthed through his analysis of the way these pre-Socratic thinkers use language, tells us something different. He is attempting to return to these original notions, to present us other possibilities than the one inherited from Plato and later thinkers and sedimented over the ages. As for being and thinking, the modern notion is to consider the thinker as a subject thinking about being as an object. Another modern idea is that logic encapsulates the method by which we think, but Heidegger thinks that such logical thinking is a distortion. Being as unconcealment is precisely what was lost due to logic, he writes. Can thinking therefore represent being in its reality? For Heidegger, truth as aletheia, as unconcealment, must happen first prior to the logical assertions and mental representations we make. The term logic comes from logos, but the pre-Socratic meaning, according to Heidegger's reading of Heraclitus, who first used the term, is gathering. Logos gathers the appearances and seemings, which are the unconcealments of being. These are differentiated by polemos, struggle, which we then give different names to the different things, which can then be used to articulate in words through language. This is why logos is also the word for language and words. It is only after unconcealment, gathering, and struggle that we can use logos to make logical assertions. As for thinking, Heidegger turns to Parmenides, who tells us that thinking and being are the same. Heidegger reads knowing, conventionally translated as thinking, as apprehending, the way we take in the gathered meaning of the world. He turns also to Sophocles, an ancient playwright who in Antigone talks about how human beings are uncanny. Uncanny in German is unheimlich, which means to not feel at home. In Greek, there is also the notion of terror, of violence. Nature, physis or being, as overwhelming sway, is able to undo human endeavors, and it is with techne or skillful knowing that human beings must do violence to physis to bring it under our control. Violence should not be understood to only mean destructive or harmful means, but to mean non-natural means that human beings take that modify what would have been the passage of nature had we left it alone. Fried explains, being requires the violence of these creative figures so that it may have a site in which to appear. It is through Dasein, through being human, that there is a being who questions what being is, that being itself can manifest as meaningful and not merely self-evident. Another term appearing in Parmenides is decay, conventionally translated as justice. Heidegger, however, thinks of decay not in a moral or judicial sense, but as fittingness. He means it in a radically ontological sense as how being gives the world its fit, its sense of an articulated structured whole that nevertheless always threatens to exceed us and leave us destitute and at a loss for understanding, adds Fried. Thinking as knowing or apprehension is then the way Dasein or human beings engage with the world, through a creative polemos or struggle to make sense of it. It is through our experience with the world that we gather, in the sense of logos, these apprehensions of the unfolding of things to become unconcealed in the sense of aletheia, so that we can discover how it all fits together in the sense of decay. The ideas we have of things are hence not in some transcendent realm, as Plato teaches, but is what we produce in our encounter with the world. Ideas are produced from our encounters and are not prior to them. Things come into our presence first, after which we encounter them, apprehend them, and then mentally work on them through logic and representational thinking to then form an idea of them. The last way of delimiting being and the odd, also speaks to the Platonic ideas. How things are may not be how they ought to be. Platonic ideas are like the tail wagging the dog. Heidegger writes, as being itself becomes fixed in its character as idea, it also tends to make up for the ensuing degradation of being. But by now, this can occur only by setting something above being that being never yet is, but always ought to be. How something ought to be is based not on how it actually is, but on some slate of values. Instead of elucidating being, these values, if not in line with the actuality of being, ends up negating being, setting something else up, what ought to be, instead of what actually is. In conclusion, Heidegger's approach is hermeneutic, depending on an interpretation of pre-Socratic thinkers to try to get to the inception of human understanding of being. Through an analysis of ancient Greek notions, by considering words and how they have since changed, leading to distortions, he tries to find out what being is. His method is hence not one of producing proof through logical argumentation, but neither is it an appeal to authority. It is hermeneutical since it relies on interpretation, but may also be genealogical in the sense that he goes to the beginnings of Western philosophy to try to get at how thinkers then originally understood things before our understanding became dominated and hence obscured by Platonic and Aristotelian ideas. This seems to suggest that he thinks that the pre-Socratics are superior in their thinking, as he indeed does argue so. However, we can also consider what he did as a meditation on what these early thinkers have written, where he in turn discovers and tries to draw from them what he thinks applies to what being is. He is bringing his readers along on his contemplative journey, showing how he arrived at his ideas. To be clear, Parmenides and Heraclitus were both not making arguments. Parmenides relates his tale as one where the goddess of justice, Decay, teaches him, while Heraclitus puts forward propositions with no explanations. In any case, even if we find Heidegger's method problematic, we can still judge whether his conclusions are wise. His conclusions are: being is not a noun, not an object, but a verb, what it is for something to be. Nature is the manifestation of being. What is comes to presence, comes into existence as what is emergent and abiding. It is not an eternal permanent form or essence, but something that becomes and then may unbecome or cease to be. It is temporal. Being is physis, being is logos, being is decay. It is nature gathered together and fitting together. Thinking as apprehension is the way human beings engage with the world. We undergo a creative struggle to make sense of it. It is through our experiences with the world that we gather these apprehensions. We apprehend how things unfold and become unconcealed, revealing their truth to us. We can then figure out how they fit together. Nature may also undo what we have created, and hence, we use our knowing through methods that modify nature to bring it under control. It is through the existence of Dasein as beings that wonder about being, that being itself can reach the fullness of its meaning, that itself can unfold to unconceal itself to beings that wonder about being. This is the first of 2 essays on Heidegger. The second will be on Heidegger's Being and Time. Thank you for listening to the Philosophical Bachelor.